So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Peterson from the University of Arizona, who is also a Leverhulme visiting professor here at the University of Manchester. How are the intellectual areas you pursue linked to your personal experience, in your opinion? And can you say a little bit about the choice of images and give a sense of the impact of the events they depict on the choices you've made?
So this is where I would start waking up, which is me coming of age in the 60s. And these depict some of the major events then. This is a massive march on Washington against the Vietnam War. The other one is Kent State, where one of the students was murdered. You know, the public forces murdered students in those days for protesting. So it's a different world, or I hope it's a different world. Now we murder them elsewhere. I'm afraid that's true, yeah. And then the other image is of water hosing African Americans and part of the civil rights struggle to gain access to schools, right? Part of the desegregation movements, politics of the 60s, all of which had a very strong effect on how I came to understand or think about or question or want to change the world I live in, yeah? So that's that part. Waking up, realizing, oh shit, it's not Kansas and my family is not representative and I've been protected in a very white, middle class environment that was very conservative, remains conservative, yet I came to learn many more things than that. The second thing is enjoying the drive, and this is Nepal, me trekking in Nepal in 1983. This is traveling through what was then Zaire, they've now changed back to the Congo. In a VW Beetle going across Africa. I spent 5 years in Africa, and that depicts the kind of conditions. Then it was in a car. Most of the time I was just hitchhiking and traveling on my own, which you just have to imagine. But it was a different era in Africa, and I never actually felt frightened or threatened in 5 years of being on my own in Africa. It certainly was challenging. But going around the world on very little money is very challenging. But the most interesting and feisty people engage in it. This is back then, 1970s, yeah, not 2010s, when you can travel around the world in your gap year and whatnot a lot more comfortably than we did then. But it was primarily people who were pretty curious and pretty willing to put up with adversity because they found it interesting. So that's the crossing borders and crossing boundaries part of what I came to actually quite enjoy and spent almost all the 1970s doing that. I ended up back in the United States voluntarily, kind of, and decided, what am I going to do? Here I am in my late 30s, yeah? And what am I going to do to support myself the rest of my life? Because I'd been a typist up till then, supporting these various things, and I didn't much enjoy that. And I thought I can either do office work or I'll just get a PhD, because I already had a BS and I had a master's degree. That I'll get a PhD, it won't take very long. And then I can teach junior college. So I proceeded to get into the International Relations doctoral program in Washington, D.C., and went there the day before the classes start, and went to the first graduate seminar, and went home to the communal house I was living in and said, shit! They expected me to know something about international relations before I got here, because I'd never taken an international relations course in my life. It was most awakening, yes. And then I quickly determined that I didn't actually think international relations is all that interesting, and I still don't think international relations is all that interesting academically. I think it's the most important topic we might consider politically, but academically, it just doesn't offer as much as I think I wish that it did. But this was 1980 when I started this program, and feminists, as I say, had invaded the academy, and there was feminist critiques of science, ways of knowing, epistemology that were really exciting to me. And so I pretty much self-studied that on my own and put up with completing a PhD as a necessity, and finally finished that 8 years later. So if you're a little slow, you know, other people have been as well, and it did prove worth it for me. And then it was time to pay back. Basically, I'd had a fabulous time on these adventures, learning a lot about myself and a lot about the world, but I really wanted to actually have some effect on the world as well. And with the PhD, I entered the job market. That took a while too. 3 years, and I was about to give up altogether when I got the job at University of Arizona. That's what I've been doing since 1990, and I do love being an academic. I think it's the best job, it's certainly the best job in the world for me. These are my offices, my office on campus. This is my office at home, which is where I am more of the time. So it's, I would say, this awareness of political realities and my global travel and seeing things, it really matters when you're on the ground, actually seeing how people live and what they deal with and how well they cope in spite of it, and the joy with which a lot of people survive situations that we would find quite non-prosperous. So those things I've tried to make sense out of in my work, tried to make some difference in regard to studying topics that might inform how do we understand what's going on, how do we change it. A critique of capitalism is the core of everything I do. Others are extensions of it, and I have always been identified as a feminist critical theorist, which I believe in precisely because I think at this particular historical juncture, not all the time, and it will change, but feminists have a bit more to say than many other critical perspectives because they actually have a commitment to change in the world, and not all the critical perspectives do in the same fashion. Being so marginalized as they are, they've had to be more creative and to explore more things and put more things together, and especially to be cross-disciplinary and cross-boundaries in order to do our work. So I'm an enthusiast for feminism, but understood very broadly, and that'll probably come up later.
So how did you bring that learning into your work? Can you say a bit more about that, how it influenced then what you were doing in terms of your PhD and the topics that you did then and continue to pursue?
I entered the doctoral program with a very critical perspective, and as I've already indicated, I was pretty critical of what I understood to be the international relations scholarship at the time, and that the feminist work and other critical, critical Marxist critiques of capitalism, critiques of racism that were surfacing, post-colonial studies that were surfacing at the time, they were interesting, and I think that I early on tried very hard to make those present in my work and to make them as interventions in international relations, which those of you who are familiar with the field know it's very resistant to critical and alternative perspectives. And especially, I would say, in those decades especially, international relations was like economics, and they both remain that way to a significant extent, although this is more of a United States phenomenon. And because the feminists, even in the early 1980s, understood things were intersectional, at least the feminists I read and that I studied and that I worked with understood perfectly well, this is not just about body parts, but it is about how feminizing something effectively devalues it, so that women's work, if it's done by men, it's still devalued. It's not about the body parts, it's about the code of gender that pretty much says, oh, if it's associated with femininity or the feminine, it just isn't worth as much or isn't as respectable, or we just don't have to pay that much attention. Yeah? I believe that rather strongly, romanticism notwithstanding. So trying to promote feminism and other critical perspectives in international relations is a hard sell. I still consider myself a hard-ass activist. Yeah? I do it differently. I still do demonstrations, but the classroom is where I try to make political change, or that's where I have the most possibility, it seems to me, and the most responsibility to try to make political change, and I do try. So I entered the job market in 1987, technically, and there was no gender feminist IR. Nada, I mean nothing. It was uninvented. The phrase didn't exist. Those adjectives, terms didn't go together. It was just that time. There were some feminist interventions in political science, but not in international relations as it is constituted in the United States. So I had my PhD because I didn't care that much about international relations, but I cared a lot about feminist anthropology and feminist history, whatnot. The question then became, what was I going to do for a dissertation? How in the world was I going to write a dissertation that would pass muster among international relations, people who had to sign off, when I didn't really want to write about international relations? So I had this great idea. The anthropologists, the feminists in those days, were asking the question of, what is the origin, the history of inequalities? You know, where did all this start? If it's not natural, right, or essentialist, then how do we explain how we got to here in terms of particular gender inequalities? So most of that work at that point was feminist anthropologists and archaeologists and classicists asking, like, well, what do we know from the records, et cetera, that can tell us what happened, a genealogy, if you will, of inequalities, which remains one of my key interests. So that was an opening for me. I took the concept of states, we all know states, right? States as in nations, and said, okay, international relations is supposed to be about the study of states, right? Well, they need to study early states. Back then, considered the rise of civilization, those early archaic states, the first time we have large-scale sedentary populations, the urban revolution, if you will, which is the first time we have centralization of political authority and power and institutions of inequality. Yeah. Before that, it's unclear. We didn't have writing, so we can't know what was really going on before we have some of the evidence like writing. We can speculate about bones and housing and things like that, but we can't know anything about what people actually thought or actually even how they were organized until we have the kind of documentation, artifacts, etc., that come with the rise of civilizations in these urban areas. So I determined that I would do a feminist genealogy of early state making, and say international relations, you look at the state, but you start in the modern state era, 1648, you know that date, that stuff, yeah? Instead of the earlier state era in which writing happens, sediments, categories, ways of thinking, believing, especially establishes marriage as a heteronormative institution. This is my current research, another angle of it, as a state creation. We have no evidence that marriage and all this extended categorization of kinship that anthropologists are very keen on, but now in the last 3 decades has been really contested as a reliable category. We have, again, don't really know, and it seems that there's a great deal of fluidity and flexibility to the way that early peoples use the notion of, like, well, we're kind of related, like people came in, had different rights and obligations, but with state formation, you get writing and you get laws, and most of the laws are about what? Regulating sex, regulating marriage and sex and property. Really important transition, watershed, if you will, in human ways of organizing their lives that contemporary modern IR misses altogether. So I have, over the years, pretty much developed a approach, strategy, or whatever, trying to get all of us to see how we're all implicated in reproducing these systems, institutions, if you will, that are differentially valuing what people do and how much their lives matter, etc. All of us have privilege. In this room, we are soaking up privilege just by being here, being in an institution of higher education. I personally think that moving across disciplines is essential to knowledge production that's relevant, but it's not very satisfying. It's not very, it doesn't generate answers. It complicates questions more than anything and shifts questions, I think. And not everyone's interested in that. We have our different preferences for what we want to do, what we want to look at, what we want to contribute. I don't see the camp versus the larger going away. What I do wish is that we were better able to actually alter the politics of the mainstream because it matters in the world. And that does not seem to be happening. For about 5 years, I focused on informalization as a political economy issue in the larger sense of all the different ways in which people do work outside of the formal sector that's regulated and recorded and taxed and is taken seriously, and some of that informal work, babysitting and under the table carpentry and whatnot, we think, oh, that's but it's all the criminal activities as well. And it's certainly all the risky and quite insecure and precarious labor. So that's happening globally, quite literally, and the university is probably one of the last holdouts in many ways. I mean, the university is, I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. As much as I diss it and have critiques of it, it remains one of the few institutions that does encourage us to think and to have some time to explore what is out there, what we might learn, what we might think about, how we might change it. The intimacy thing I take quite differently as just the latest in my exploration of intellectual questions, or actually political questions. And the research I'm interested in is, it seems to me that my lifelong engagement with international relations is about trying to persuade the discipline to have some effect on the discipline, to take seriously the personal does matter. You know, whether we're talking about race, gender, sexuality, you know, it matters. Will you bloody get with the program and start to take seriously, engage with all the work that's out there already and all the ways in which it really is significant that the personal is political, is international, that it matters. And there's a bit more space for that, I would say, in the last decade because of the emergence and proliferation of writing, both in terms of feminism but also queer theory and post-colonial studies that have made it clear, and the critique of imperialism that's been going on a long time, but I think it has reemerged in some corners because of the imperialism that we're actually actively playing out on the planet at the moment. Intimacy isn't spatially specific. So, you know, you have a lot of the dichotomies that are being criticized, have been criticized endlessly yet still play. They have some spatial connotation with them, like public and private, or even civilized and primitive. You can imagine a space. But intimacy, I think, doesn't fit that, doesn't fall into those two easy chunks or categories.
Current day, as in right now, do you think authors are doing enough? You know, you're talking about changing the world in a certain way and looking at what's going on and raising awareness and political consciousness really in the areas of privilege. And so I'm interested, historically, I would say literature has moved towards changing the world, but right now, do you think authors are stepping up to the plate, and what more could they do?
I think that the only answer I can really give, which is what I give to a lot of questions, it depends. Certainly there are individuals who are just doing their damnedest, and some of them are doing more their damnedest than others. And I imagine there's a great deal of literature that isn't being read, isn't broadcast, isn't available enough because of the power structures that preclude the circulation of critical work. And I'm ill-prepared to speak about the effects of literature, I mean, in general. But in regard to, I don't know what it means to hold authors adequately responsible. Here I am pretending to hold IR as a discipline responsible for not saving the world. Okay, so that's a bit lame. I think that international relations as a discipline is the area of inquiry that is most reasonably expected to ponder and respond to and provide insights on power relations at the global level, which means a whole lot of other things as well. And I don't think they've done a very good job, and I think we could do a better job, that it's not impossible without thinking you're going to have answers or, you know, like quick fixes, whatever. So in that sense, I think you can talk about responsibility. And as an academic, I don't know where my responsibility begins and ends, and nor can I determine for anyone else what their boundary there is. And again, everyone's facing pressures that are placed by the institutions, the systems we live within, which and determine what choices we have about employment, about our life opportunities in ways that are the core of the matter. And if you feel threatened, risk, it's too much of a risk to take, then of course that's not going to happen. And then there's also just the failure of educational systems over the decades to deliver critical education. So that institutional failure I would call out again. Individual authors, I don't know. It's not clear to me how much individuals are not stepping up and how much it's impossible or it's the impediments to stepping up shape those conditions and who does and who doesn't.
Yeah, in terms of making a difference, Spike, you said at one point that what you would really like to be able to do is to alter the politics of the mainstream, but you haven't seen that that's something that the academic world does very much. Can you think of any examples over any time when academia has influenced the politics of the mainstream? And if you can, then what was the mechanism? What were the conditions that enable that to happen?
Well, that is the question, isn't it? How does large, macro social change occur? It's a perennial question for sociology. for political science in some fashion, certainly for international relations. If you want to change the world, first you have to assume people want to change the world. And there seem to be a variety of answers that depend on the particulars of the context. So sometimes collective organization matters. We're political scientists. I'm enough of a political scientist, even I believe that, yeah? That unionization mattered. Getting the vote mattered, putting pressure on legislative procedures and whatnot, getting particular kinds of approaches elected, that kind of thing. It matters. I personally feel that at the moment, what frightens me the most is the reluctance and the withdrawal and the limited critique of capitalism as a way to organize the world. And with my students, you know, I rave on about queer theory and gender politics, and they're just fine with that. You know, like go to critique capitalism, and they're like, you can't be serious. You can't be serious. Everyone wants to be in the United States. It's the best place in the world. What can we do without capitalism? That's what made everything great. Yeah? And I get where they're coming from. I used to believe that myself, you know. I mean, and it's what in the United States especially, you just hear it over and over, and no one with public media and broadcast media, I'm not sure what all goes on in social media. Independent media doesn't have the strength, the power to propel an alternative, a critical voice. So people are actually just really confused. I mean, I do think that a great deal of what's going on right now in the United States with Trump is confusion. We exist as individuals in some sense, but always within these systems, these institutions, these norms, these practices, these expectations, these economic trade-offs, if you will, choices. That for me, it's to try to identify and help other people realize the systems, how they operate, and they are hurting all of us differently, but all of us are hurt in the long run and in the bigger picture because we're all scared. And to be able to do something with that seems to me one avenue is understanding better what's going on so that whatever effort, attempt, practice, intervention you make has, at least one hopes, the most effective intervention you can make. So if I wanted to change the world through playing piano, it probably wouldn't get very far. I've tried to make an effect through what I do, and it means I'm not doing all sorts of other things, like the ivory tower thing I said. I thought for what, you know, like, why am I not a street fighter? Why am I not organizing these secretaries? I don't like this job. Why don't I organize secretaries? Because they don't like it either. But instead, you know, I either copped out or decided, oh, you'll have much better ability to make a difference here. So it's not a question anybody can answer for anybody else. But overall, I think we all need to attempt to take responsibility for whatever choice we make. How does it affect the world we live in? Thank you.